My name's Resham Kotecha. I'm the Global Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute. We're just going to give everyone 30 seconds or so to come in, but please do introduce yourselves in the chat. It would be great to know who we've got here, where you're from. We've got a great international audience today. And then before we start, I'll do some brief housekeeping, but I will keep it brief as I know you're here for the brilliant panelists we've got and you want to hear from them. Hello, everybody. For those who are just joining now, we'll be starting imminently. My name's Resham Kotecha. I'm the Global Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute. We're just giving the others 30 seconds to trickle in and then we shall start. But in the meanwhile, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from. If you want to share anything more than that, you're very welcome to. And then we will do some brief housekeeping and begin. Just so that everybody knows, the webinar will be recorded. So please just be aware of that. Great to see people introducing themselves in the chat already. Some interesting responses already. So we've got London, Northern Ireland, Canada. It's great to see such global attendance so far. So thank you all so much. So I'll start now. I know we've got some people who will be joining us shortly, but thank you very much to those of you who were able to join us promptly at 4. My name is Resham Kotecha. I'm the Global Head of Policy here at the Open Data Institute. So we'll be starting shortly, but please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name and where you're from. If you'd like to ask a question, please add it into the chat and we will do our best to have it asked and answered by these experts in the Q&A session. And just so you know, the webinar will be recorded and we will be sharing it on our YouTube channel afterwards. We do have a brilliant newsletter that comes out every week, the Week in Data. So if you would like us to send it to you, please do sign up. My colleagues will share the link to that in the chat. Otherwise, you can always follow up afterwards and sign up to that through our website. There's lots of great stuff that comes on. So thank you so much to all of you who have joined us from kind of a great global audience here for joining us for today's webinar, launching the ODI's European Data and AI Policy Manifesto. So I will be explaining about what that is, but I would firstly just like to introduce and welcome our great panelists to you all. So you should be able to see in the chat now, there's a QR code. If you'd like to utilize that to sign up, you can do that. And I will move on to introducing our panelists. So we've got, as I said, some excellent panelists for you who are all far more knowledgeable than me on this topic. So I'm really delighted to have them. In no particular order, we do not play favorites here at the ODI. We have Mike Pisa. He works on global economic policy issues at Google. So he focuses on the economic impact of digital technologies. Earlier in his career, Mike worked at the US Treasury Department, where he served as a senior advisor in the Office of International Affairs and deputy director of the Office of International Finance. And most recently, he was a fellow at the Center for Global Development, where he researched the relationship between digital governance and economic growth. And he has a PhD from the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Anne Kristen Glenster is Executive Director of the Glenled Centre, Deputy Director of the Mindrew Centre for Technology and Democracy, and an affiliate of the Centre for Intellectual Property and Information Law at the University of Cambridge. She's an expert on data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property in relation to AI governance and regulation of the infosphere and digital infrastructure. She is currently researching the relationship between epistemic rights, so I knew I was going to tongue tie on that, deceptive design and neurotechnologies, and she takes great interest in the integrity of research and use of technology in education. She's been a policy advisor for several organizations, has authored several reports, I'm sure we'll be able to share those with you, and has made recommendations to the UK Parliament, government departments, European Parliament, European Commission, US Federal Trade Commission, and many, many more. She, as you can tell, is eminently qualified, as is our third panelist, Elena Simple, who is the ODI's Director of Research and Professor of Computer Science at King's College London, where she leads the King's Institute for AI. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the British Computer Society, a Hans Fisher Senior Fellow, and a distinguished member of the Association for Computing Machinery. Her research is in human-centric AI, exploring socio-technical questions around the management, use, and governance of data in AI applications. In her very impressive career, she's led 14 national and international research projects, contributing to a further 26. And she leads our program of research on data-centric AI, which my colleagues will share the link to in the chat. Please do give that a read. It's fascinating work. And that studies and designs the socio-technical data infrastructure of AI models and applications. She's chaired many conferences in AI, as you can imagine, and was in the experts group that contributed to the EU AIA Code of Practice. So, and could talk much more about our panelists, but I'm going to stop there because you can read much more about them. And I think it's really important that we get on to talking about why we're here, the overview of our manifesto, why it matters, its contents, and then get into the juicy Q&A. So why does the manifesto matter now? Why did the ODI work on this manifesto? Well, the geopolitical rift on data, big tech, and AI between the EU and their traditional allies of the USA and the UK were becoming more and more obvious. And we thought this was a really important time to consider the divergence between these three kind of groups in terms of the data, big tech, and AI regulation. There's, as you all know, an implementation backlash against the EU AI Act, and obviously challenges with differences in digital sovereignty and digital adequacy. And we thought this was a particularly important time for us to consider the increased interest in recognizing data as a strategic asset, something that the Open Data Institute has been kind of passionately talking about since our start well over a decade ago. And we recognize that Europe finds itself at a crossroads in the decisions it will make regarding data, digital, and AI as it looks to see what's happening both East and West. So we thought this was a particularly important time to pull together the manifesto. Some of you will have seen we did a similar manifesto considering similar topics for the UK last March. My colleagues will share a link to that. We put it before all parties ahead of the election, and so we thought it was a perfect time to look at across the EU and see the relevance there. So what does the manifesto call for? Well, it's gone live, so my colleagues will share the link to it, but keeping it high level, just so you're up to scratch on what we said, it calls for a number of things, and we align these into 6 key principles. So if we just go to the next slide. So when we look at what the manifesto calls for, our 6 key principles: strong data infrastructure, open data as a foundation, trusted and independent organizations, a diverse, equitable, and inclusive data ecosystem, and data knowledge and skills. And we thought these were really important so that we could develop and build a strong foundation for a trustworthy digital ecosystem. And we also thought what was really valuable and important was participatory governance, something that moves beyond simple transparency to actual meaningful and involved citizen participation. We thought this was important to have regulatory coherence across the digital quiz rather than fragmented compliance. We know that different member states implement policy and acts in slightly different ways. And of course, we know that tech companies and those interacting with AI and data are doing so across borders and having to manage multiple regulatory environments. We also thought global leadership through privacy enhancing technologies and world-class AI assurance standards were hugely important. It's an exciting time. Europe has the opportunity to pioneer a data-centric and people-centric model of digital governance, which balances economic competitiveness with fundamental rights. So it's a very high-level overview of the manifesto. Please do give it a read. There's an exec summary, but also lots of detail. But for now, I'm going to start by opening up our panel discussion. As I said, we will give opportunity and time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please do pop them in the chat so that we can make sure that your brilliant panelists here have an opportunity to come to that. But first, I'll start by going to Mike to ask, what economic factors determine whether firms can successfully leverage AI and data for competitive advantage?
Sure. Thanks, Resham. And first, I'll just say thank you to you and the ODI team for having me here. It's, as you mentioned, I used to be a researcher at Center for Global Development, and I was working on data governance and development issues. And I was always impressed and maybe a bit irked by the fact that ODI always got to the issues I wanted to write about first and did it better. And so congrats on all the work your team has done. And I would say I'm looking at the folks who are joining, and it's a really very diverse expertise in the group. So I'm looking forward to Q&A. So to the question of like what factors determine how well EU firms can leverage AI and data for competitive advantage. I think, I'm now at Google. We're doing a lot of work supporting researchers looking at what AI adoption, trends in AI adoption. Obviously, we're at very early stages, and I should say a lot of the work we do in Europe is coming from a project we're doing with the Copenhagen Business School, and I'm going to be kind of reporting on some of the findings from one of their early surveys. And I think in a lot of ways the findings aren't that surprising, and we see ICT companies and companies in professional services are showing the highest rates of AI adoption. The predominant use of AI for these companies is data analysis, information retrieval, decision support. In certain highly regulated sectors like health, the adoption levels are a bit slower, but increasingly we're seeing them use AI to kind of streamline processes. And I guess I would just emphasize that like AI adoption, I think is where the action is at. If we have narrow adoption, limited to ICT companies, limited to big tech companies, we are not going to get anywhere near like the AI's economic potential that we see referenced in lots of different studies. So I think we need to be focused on kind of supporting broad AI adoption across industries and across firms of all sizes. One other point I'd make on adoption is that I think things get most interesting in the high risk sectors, right? Obviously, that's where we think adoption is going to be slowest, but that's also where adoption could be of the highest value, where using AI can actually bring down risk. I think of like in medicine and transportation, where AI has been shown to reduce human error rates and kind of lead to improved outcomes for both passengers and patients. A second really interesting finding, I think, is that generative AI is not a leapfrog technology. I think early on there was some sense that, like mobile phones in sub-Saharan Africa, the use of generative AI would allow firms to kind of skip a level, maybe in terms of data infrastructure and data governance, and that they would be able to use these tools and just, reach insights without doing the dirty work of building out a strong data foundation. And that's just not the case. It doesn't allow firms to skip over investments in building infrastructure. And it's probably making data governance even more important, right? Because maximizing AI's benefits requires combining data across various parts of firms and even across firms and sectors. So data governance is even more important than it was before the generative AI moment. And then the third finding, maybe not surprising, but the degree to which it's coming up is a bit surprising to me, is just how difficult it is for EU firms to operate across member state jurisdictions because the regulatory landscape is so fragmented. So in the manifesto, you mentioned, initiatives like the European Common Data Spaces. These are really integral, I think, to helping kind of EU firms like reach kind of a level playing field. But absent bigger reforms on simplifying the digital regulatory regime in Europe, I think they're just not going to be enough to get firms there.
Thanks, Mike. That's really helpful. I know it's always when you're the first one put on there, it's always a challenge. So thank you for giving us so much content and value there. And then I saw you nodding along there to kind of Mike's comments about the regulatory framework and firms successfully leveraging AI and data. So I'd love you to build on that, but also set out your views on how and where European regulatory requirements are helping or hindering this process.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we always talk about the role of regulation, and sometimes with technology in a field that is advancing as quickly as we have experienced AI in the last 2.5 years. It's quite hard to get things right, to get the timing right, to get the conditions right, and so on and so forth. So you ultimately end up discussing a lot about this tension and this trade-off between what you can and should regulate, how you would do it, and the impact it would have across the ecosystem. What I think we should do instead is perhaps understand that regulation is never the full solution. Just because you have the best piece of legislation on its own, is not going to achieve the outcomes we want. Tighter regulation doesn't necessarily kill the innovation. I mean, California is not perceived, not even from Europe, as being a part of the world that is completely deregulated. On the contrary, when it comes to technology, there's some very interesting regulatory developments there. At the same time, California is home to some of the most innovative companies in the world. So it's a much bigger discussion than just regulation, innovation, when to regulate, what would that do to different organizations across the ecosystem, how to do it. Having said that, I think it is important to acknowledge where we are right now in Europe, and the effects that regulation in Europe has had, both on European companies, but also on other companies across the globe, both when it comes to how to regulate. So we have seen various other countries adopting some measures that Europe has put in place. At the same time, we've also seen at the European level a recognition that in this rapidly changing field, there is a good case to assess the impact of some of the bigger regulatory packages, including GDPR, including Data Governance Act, and iterate. But of course, it's also worth acknowledging that Europe is a very diverse continent, and that single market is advancing. But compared perhaps to the pace that a well-funded, well-positioned multi-corporate is advancing, is not going to be exactly the same. There's other checks and balances, there's other processes, and I think there is good reasons for it to stay the same.
Absolutely. And I have to say, before I joined the ODI, I was at a fintech unicorn, and that, the challenges you've both addressed, very real. So Ann-Kristin, I'd love to come to you now to talk about your views on how data portability and interoperability requirements can level the playing field for European competitors.
Oh, that is a difficult question, but I think it's a crucial place to start. And so I want to take us a step out before going that technical and deep.
Please do.
And say what has changed, because we know that the EU has a lot of high-level comprehensive regulation, the DSA, the DMA, the AI Act, the GDPR, and so on. And then we had the Draghi report in 2024 that said the EU is lagging behind in competition, and we're not finding the investment, and we're not building. And so with that, and also we have a geopolitical moment, as you alluded to, that means that we've changed our attitude towards security. And so with that comes the question then of how do we have open data? How do we have open systems? How do we work together at the same time as we're trying to do tech sovereignty, as we're trying to do digital sort of sovereignty and control? How do we find a language that will do both? And I think that's where interoperability and these sort of technical standards will be key, absolutely key going forward, because they are non-politicized in a way, and we need them across the board. So a lot of the projects I'm seeing are about standardization and finding ways to introduce these kinds of technical measures in regulation. So that's the starting point. And if I could just make a few comments on the other interventions we've had. So first of all, also congratulate the ODI on an excellent report and these great principles. And I'm looking at the ambition for the AI Continent Action Plan that the EU has published, and I'm thinking these are the kind of principles that can guide the adoption or the road to getting that plan executed. So I think it's a really smart thing to do, because of course I tried to do 5 different things together, and how do you do it? But key, as was mentioned several times already, is simplification of the rules. And this is where it gets really interesting, because as Elena also said, it's not about getting rid of regulation necessarily. So I don't see any sort of move towards lightening this sort of regulatory grip on AI or tech specific regulation, but instead we're seeing talk about simplifying rules when it comes to corporate law, labor law, tax law, all of these other things that have been alluded to, that is a part of the problem we're having with competition in the single market. So a lot of regulatory things are happening, but maybe not where we expect them.
Fascinating. So, Mike, I want to pick up on that about unexpected regulation that Kristen has mentioned, and Elena referenced California, and that tighter regulation doesn't necessarily mean cramping innovation. So, what's your experience on the current balance between regulatory certainty and innovation flexibility in Europe? How's that viewed by companies like Google and others? And what are your thoughts on where tighter regulation might actually support you in your work and help with innovation at Google?
I don't know if it's a question of tight or loose. I think it's a question of being a focused regulation. And I think where to be very frank, I think in the global conversation on how AI, let's focus just on AI right now, on how AI is regulated is that Europe's approach, or maybe the best way to say is, I mean, the Brussels effect was a very strong effect around GDPR and other policies. You are not seeing the same level of global impact. You are not seeing other countries take a similar approach, a horizontal approach, let's say a comprehensive horizontal approach to regulating AI that the EU is taking. Other countries are stepping back. Many are taking a wait and see approach because the technology, to Anne, Kristen, and Elena's point, is like everything is evolving so rapidly that folks want to think, I think, a little more deeply on assessing the impact ex ante before establishing new laws. And I think what you see, and you see this in the UK, you see this in Singapore, is kind of explicitly, for the time being, rejecting a comprehensive horizontal approach, saying we are going to take a sector-specific approach. We are going to focus on uses of the technology rather than try to regulate the technology at the highest level, which is quite difficult because it's general purpose technology. So there are myriad ways that technology is going to manifest, right? And they're also thinking of ways that of using existing laws to regulate AI. So not adding additional layers of complexity that firms will need to comply with. And I think you asked for Google's view. I think when I think about it, it's like Google and other large tech companies can pay the compliance price that's involved with dealing with the complexities of these laws. We don't want to. We think it's beneficial for everyone involved that we don't have to do that, and that we can provide, cutting edge technology for lower cost. But it's the smaller firms that this is actually absolutely a barrier for, and that it's much more difficult for them to overcome.
Absolutely, such a valid point there. It's the big chaps that have to do the kind of make the argument for the ones that don't have the capacity, the resources, the time. And Elena, I'd love to come to you then on how do you think the EU can coordinate enforcement approaches across member states? Because all of you have referenced the challenge of diverging applications of regulations or enforcement. So what are your thoughts on how they could coordinate that better?
I think it's a very, very hard thing to do. There's a new AI office in place. There is the experience from a whole package of data and AI related laws and legislation that has been in the making in the last decade or so. I don't know if there is enough engagement across the stakeholder ecosystem. So one of the things you mentioned, I think, in the introduction, was that I was part of the code of practice process. That was an attempt to broaden that scope. Of course, there's timelines and it's a difficult subject, but it could have been done much, much better. Just like with, I don't want to keep coming, we seem to be coming back to the AI Act specifically, but that legislation went through so many iterations just in response to what was happening in the world, that we have ended up with essentially a safety legislation that is trying to regulate a technology with many different use cases, like it regulates, I don't know, a fridge. or a toy for a child. And with the code of practice, we've seen to some degree similar developments, where at the beginning there was this aim to be very participatory and very open. At the same time, the timelines that were in place meant that only very large teams, policy teams, were able to engage. And then as we approach the final iteration of the code of practice, delays happen, changes happen that weren't as easy to reproduce as some of the initial phases of the process, where there was more engagement. So now, if you add to this layer of complexity of what is happening in the individual member states, and coordinating between them, plus the fact that there's question marks about the ability and the willingness of legislators, regulators, to enforce any of these large legislative tools that they have created. And then, you will, plus the delays and the unclarity around when would certain things come into effect, and companies be expected to comply. So I would say we haven't seen the end of this with the AI Act, and it's interesting that the result that we have right now, to a large degree, was already covered by various voluntary commitments. Especially by some of the bigger players that have been thinking about some of these questions, hard questions, for a long time, and we know very little about what is going to happen, how this is going to affect some of the smaller players. I haven't answered the question. I don't think there is an easy way to answer your question. I think there's a lot
That's
of.
all right. It was a mean question.
And some observations from, let's just say, lived experience.
Well, thank you for sharing your insights onto how those contributions and consultations work. And actually, it's something the policy team at the ODI have found, even if, Mike, you said you can make the argument, even if the small organizations can't, even if you do have bigger players making the arguments, the reality is often for small organizations, you have to be very careful about how you expend resources and what you can pick and choose to respond to on the consultations. And I think we'll come back to that as a point in terms of how we can really support and engage and make sure the public, civil society, small businesses can really feed in what they think is important. But for now, Ann-Kristin, I'd love to come to you. And for the audience, please do pop questions into the box. We're starting to collate them, and I'll make sure you have time to ask your questions. But for now, Ann-Kristin, I'd love to talk to you about data adequacy between the UK and the EU. So we've got the UK-EU data adequacy agreement renewal deadline in December at the end of this year. What are the economic and strategic risks if adequacy is lost? And how would you advise or recommend that the EU balances regulatory integrity with pragmatic cooperation?
A difficult question. So to explain, in case there are people are not familiar with this the GDPR adequacy requirement, which means that you have to ensure that where you're sending data, personal data from the EU, that it goes into a country that has a similar regime. Now, with Schrems 2, so the case of Schrems by the Court of Justice of the European Union, the court, as in many cases, took a very broad view of what the law meant, and said that what that meant was that the legal protection in the country receiving the data had to be essentially equivalent to the GDPR, which means basically the same. In the new Data Use and Access Act that we've just adopted in the UK, we're now saying it has to be materially not lower. Now that's going back on the wording of essentially equivalent. Whether that will pass muster or not with the EU, we don't know yet. So there is a question there about, will this be acceptable or not? And the ICO also has a few the Information Commissioner's Office also has a few points about, for example, automated decision making, that the protection against that has been lowered and so on. Should the UK not retain its adequacy status, it will have a massive impact because the EU is such a big partner and because the definition of personal data is so extremely broad at Article 4. So it touches almost everything. So the economic impact will be there. If so, one has to go over to different kind of mechanisms in the GDPR. So it's possible, but it will be a much more expensive compliance regime for small businesses particularly. So not disastrous in terms of nothing at all, but it will be difficult. That said, it's not clear if, although what the court has said is very clear, it's not clear that the EU will enforce this as strictly. And we've seen that, although we've mentioned it already with the Brussels effect with the GDPR, meaning basically the EU makes a law for the EU and suddenly everybody else has to adopt the same law. We also had the idea of, I can't remember the name of it, but there was an Irish town where the Irish Data Protection Authority moved to for a few years. And there was a countering effect named after that town because the Irish Data Protection Authority notoriously didn't really enforce the GDPR. So that comes back to the regulatory issue of, it doesn't matter if we have a great law, if the member states choose to not enforce it in a harmonized way. So at the moment, I think in terms of adequacy, wait and see.
That's great, thank you. And Mike, I want to follow on to that question when we're talking about how, well, I mean, of course, the impact between different markets, but how do you or how does Google view that challenge, not just of data adequacy between the EU and the UK, but just in general managing different kind of data regimes, and how can you meaningfully participate or support calls for a more cohesive kind of enactment of regulation or application of it?
I mean, I think I would just say broadly, and obviously there's the action over the channel and then there's the action over the Atlantic, and there's a lot of, during this period of kind of trade negotiations, there can be tensions in the discussions around, cross-border data flows. I mean, I don't have a good extensive answer. I would just say at a very high level, what do we know about data flows like predicated on trust, right? So it's trust between customers and the companies they're their users and the services they're using, and it's trust between governments. And our position has been we are willing to work with all governments to kind of let cooler heads prevail in order to try to make sure that the institutions we have established to facilitate trusted data flows are not brought into these more tense trade negotiations in other spaces.
Thank you, Mike. And Kristen, Mike just referenced trust there. So I just want to come to you about privacy enhancing technologies, because of course, one of the challenges we see is people feeling nervous about data and privacy, even if they don't fully understand the implications, they feel kind of this innate sense of, is it safe? So what specific policy incentives could accelerate pet adoption across the EU's common European data spaces?
Oh, I think we need to ask first of all, should it? Should we even,
Good question.
Encourage these, or should we not just have good privacy in all tech, full stop? Instead of this extra layer. I mean, that would be my starting point. In terms of policy, we already have it in the law. For example, Article 25 of GDPR says data protection by design or default. So there is some sort of incentive already there. And then there's the question of how do you enforce that, which is difficult. But if you sharpen the enforcement mechanism there and said, these are tools you can use there. When it comes to pets, though, it always makes me think of Lawrence Lessig's 4 modalities of regulation, market law, norms, and code, and thinking when the computer says no, it just doesn't happen. So they're great in that sense. We don't need to then worry so much about other things. The problems with pets is, of course, economics. Can only people who can afford that kind of tech get the benefit of these privacy products? But that, of course, is true for all products. So it's a difficult one. But often we say that people who really need more privacy are the ones who are most vulnerable. So it's a complex conversation. But there are incentives in the law if the guidelines would encourage it, I would say.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Elena, coming to you then, because I know you do a lot of work on pets. How can pets scale, do you think, to support both compliance and innovation? Do you have thoughts on incentives that could accelerate, the question of whether it should accelerate adoption or not, but more, how can it be accessible to people that are most vulnerable and need it?
I think it's important also to acknowledge that privacy enhancing technologies covers many different things. Yeah, so passwords are a privacy enhancing technology. Any ways to manage access to a website, to an application, to a data set through login passwords and multi-factor authentication, all these things that everyone loves when they're asked to do, is one of those. And then, okay, you get to much more complex and advanced and computationally intensive technologies like cryptography and now with AI as well, federated learning, so means to be able to learn from data without having to bring all data from different parties into one place, or to give everyone who is benefiting from the learning results access to the entire data set. There's questions around cost, but there's also questions around trust and around literacy. So one of the recent projects we have done at the ODI, actually, and it happens with some of your colleagues at Google, was looking at how a pet's technology, in this case, it's a tool or a technology called a trusted research environment or a trusted execution environment, where you store and manage a piece of very sensitive data like in a digital vault. And then you do all the computation that you need, all the calculations that you need in that vault. So what we looked at is how can these vaults be more trusted as a pathway to adoption. And we at the ODI, we talk a lot about openness, about transparency, about how open ecosystems are possibly the best way to achieve good outcomes for everyone. But that's not enough. So making something open source, if there is no broader trust in the organization, in the team, in the technology, can make those attempts to well-intended attempts to open up technology, perhaps not as successful as they could be. I think there's also a question of standards, a question of interoperability, a question of how the infrastructure that would enable a wider rollout of certain types of technologies could become sustainable. So at the ODI last year, we became the steward of an open source project founded by our founder, Tim Berners-Lee, which is all about a different way to manage personal data. So personal data is essentially my queries in the search engine, or my prompts in ChatGPT, or all of that. This is sort of data that I'm sharing when I want to access different digital services. Say, Solid is a way to not give that data away to be managed by a third party or by the organization that is providing that digital service, where that data is still managed by the individual or someone a third party they trust. It's an interesting idea. I think personally, it's very important that technology is developed open source, just like the web is open available to everyone, to reduce some of those frictions. But of course, literacy is key, and there's still a big hill to climb there.
Amazing, thank you so much. So I can see lots of questions coming in. So I would just encourage you, if you want them asked, to give them to us now, just so that I can make sure we've got time for all of them. I'll start asking some of them. I've got lots of my own. But Mike, I'd love to ask you, the questions come in. I won't I'll name names unless you've asked me not to. Jess Cosman has asked, how can we demonstrate to industry the financial return on investment from establishing proper governance of data used by AI tools?
Yeah, I don't think industry needs to be convinced. I think it was the question about investment in better. Let me read the question real quick. Investment at establishing proper AI governance. I might take this in a slightly different direction, but I think I understand the question. So I think, like, as industry understands the need for access to high quality data, and also locally pertinent data, right? I mean, because that's the data that's going to help tailor local solutions if you're building at the application layer, or if you're building at the level of training large language models. That is the data that is desired. And I think one of the issues, though, is taking an economic approach to this question is the public good aspect of data, right? Because data is non-rival, we expect that data is going to be not invested there's going to be a market failure where high quality data is not going to be invested to the level that society would benefit most from. And I think that gets to the question of governments, right? So it's going to have to be a partnership between governments and private sector on determining what types of data need to be produced. I think there's a sad state of the world, which is that I used to work on this question of national statistical offices and the investment they got from their budgets to produce, high quality statistical data. It's always very under-resourced, right? Particularly in low middle income countries. And now we even see in a number of Western countries that, like, statistical capacity is kind of falling down the priority list of legislators and budget makers. So I think finding ways to make it clear to governments the value, because industry understands the value but might still underproduce. I hope that gets at some of the question.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. I think that absolutely does. So and Kristen, I'd love to come to you about the Online Safety Act, because obviously that's in place within the UK. How can we ensure that AI providers are ensuring that children can use or consume AI in a safe manner, and that AI models are mindful about the processing of children's data?
I can't give a definite answer. I know the Online Safety Act quite well. I was part of the discussions when it was enacted, and there's something called the Online Safety Network, run by Maeve, whose last name escapes me, and Lorna Woods at Exeter University, that look at the implementation. Because what we're finding now, particularly in terms of children, is that there's code being written for sort of age-appropriate codes, verification of ages, and various mechanisms. There are many ways to try to keep children safe, but of course it becomes a question of censorship on the other hand. So do we want algorithms that push certain things to some people or not? Or do we just put a ban on certain things? I think this is for the regulators to find out what is practical and technical solutions we're finding. I just don't know, but I know there's lots going on. So I would say check out the Online Safety Network. They have a great website, and they will tell you all of the various things that is cooking.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to come now back to mic for a second, and then I've got a question for you. So Cathay's asked, as a California resident, I'm wondering about a bit of an extension about the conversation about trust and cross-border collaboration and data sharing, to think about ways that individual US states like California could be a trusted partner for EU and UK corporations and organizations, even at a time when the US itself might not be. Do you have any thoughts about partnering with specific states?
Yeah, I think this is an outcome that the California legislature might be very fond of thinking in the same way. And of course, California does have a history of setting standards and then the rest of the country following, if not the rest of the world. Like think about auto emissions. I do think, given where these issues stand, and I'm thinking just within the US at a national level, at a federal level, the tension around the discussion around AI moratorium, which, as I think the person who asked the question noted, that effort fell through, at least in the initial phase. I think that path is probably unlikely, even if it would be one that folks in Sacramento would like to lead in the direction of. I just think it could lead to actually making transatlantic discussions, for one, more contentious around these issues.
Mm-hmm. Amazing, thank you. That's really fascinating to hear. And we have been asked a question about geopolitics, so I'll come on to that in a second. But Elena, it'd be great to hear from you. Terry Jackson's asking about what formal communication arrangements exist between the ODI and the government regarding the development of the AI Opportunities Action Plan.
So there's no formal arrangements, formal communication or formal arrangements of any kind. We, just as many others in the UK, have been consulted, have expressed our views before the AI Opportunities and Action Plan was created. That's all on our website. This was not done part of a formal arrangement, though the ODI until March this year was co-founded by VSIT. It was not part of a formal arrangement of any kind. In particular, when it comes to the AI Opportunities and Action Plan, our input has focused on the National Data Library, perhaps unsurprisingly, because this is that one central, future potential data asset that brings together data from across government, from research, from various other places, and publishes it and makes it available across the ecosystem so that those opportunities can happen. So we have written about this, and everything we have written about this is in the public domain, and we are continuing to think and are open to work together with DCIT and the wider government to make sure this is happening. Fact is, the latest we have, for a while, we haven't heard a lot about the National Data Library from government. The latest we have heard, I think it's from the industrial strategy, where we know there's investment. We have also seen there's a number of roles that are being recruited. This is all very, very positive. At the same time, like with many of these large government projects, there's a risk that the NDL will be seen as the investment that will have to solve all data issues of the UK, and that's not the case either. Yeah, to summarize, there's no formal collaboration agreement, and it doesn't need to be. So there's other ways to express your views and work together with government in the UK and elsewhere to make sure that what we do here, our projects, our research, does inform, when relevant, what is happening in government.
Thank you, Elena. And I'll just to follow on to that, as Elena mentioned, the ODI shares lots of its consultation responses and conversations online. We also write up a lot of our meetings, but we also regularly hold roundtables similar to this, where we run through our draft policy papers or talk through events that have happened. So we'll hold one, for example, well, 2 in October to go over the main party conferences here in the UK. But if you are not yet signed up, please do sign up for our newsletter, because that's where you'll get invitations, and we do try and run events that our members are interested in, so you can always request them as well. And then we've had a question about the manifesto itself from Chippo. How will success be measured? What does impact look like a year from now? That's a really great question. I mean, similar to what we did with our UK manifesto, but with this EU one, I mean, obviously today's a great start, you know, of having hundreds of people that are engaged and interested in kind of reading the results, but we'll share it with relevant policymakers across EU member states, but also wider than that, to make sure that the impact is really there, that people are hearing the calls for action. And then we leverage these manifestos by putting them forward to policymakers, asking for meetings, and kind of explaining the benefits and the values of the 6 principles we've set out. So that's how we'll kind of measure success, and the impact of the manifesto will be policymakers actually recognizing the importance and values of these policies. We'll also write up today's meeting and share that, and use that as a base to kind of have those conversations with big tech, small tech, entrepreneurs, innovators, policymakers, other civil society organizations, so we can build a coalition around these principles and the conversations we've had today. So I'd love to ask you and Kristen, questions come in from Chelsea. What are the main regulatory challenges in ensuring data protection while promoting AI innovation?
So I would say the biggest challenge is actually where we started this conversation with, how quickly the technology is evolving and how, you know, we can't foresee it. So to give you a very clear example, I've been doing a lot of work on generative AI and the creative industries. But even, you know, if we look at it from a data protection lens, from a very sort of technical, legal perspective, large language models that have been built with training data script indiscriminately from the internet are illegal under the GDPR. They just are, because they also then contain what's called special category data, which is sensitive data, which you have to have certain things around in order to use, right? Now, and still we have them. And so every regulator is sort of twisting themselves, trying to find out a way to say, yes, it's legal, although on the letter of the law, it's not. So we see a challenge. And I use that as an example, not because I think that they're going to be outlawed tomorrow or we're going to find a ruling against them, but to say when we have these kinds of advances, suddenly we're going to go, oh, we didn't prepare for it, even though we have technological neutral language and so on. Which comes back to the tension that Mike also talked about, the sort of sector specific versus these large comprehensive ideas, and being nimble with regulation. So I think the unknown at the moment is the biggest challenge.
Absolutely, and I'm going to come back to, I'm going to copy Anne Kristen and come back to Mike also on something he said previously about tech firms and not being able to leapfrog poor infrastructure, because we've actually had a question about that even if even tech firms can't leapfrog poor infrastructure, what support exists for mission-led organizations or small organizations to build ethical and usable systems? So what's your thinking on how we can support you know, charities, civil society, small organizations to feel more positive about AI and their ability to step forward without necessarily having the infrastructure to do so?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think all is not lost because it's not a leapfrog technology, right? I think it just means that it has to be step by step, and you have to have the right data governance foundations. You have to have the right data infrastructure. Ideally, you're working in a jurisdiction where you have access to high quality public data that, you know, for whatever questions you're pursuing, you can use that data and combine it with your own. I think the optimistic take is that cloud services, and of course this is a perspective of a company that offers cloud services, but I think it's true. Cloud services today can provide a lot of those solutions in a very cost-effective way, right? Because they can scale with you if you're a mission-driven small organization, as you became a larger organization, ideally, that those services and the applications that you use can can scale up and shift as needed. So I think if you compare back to mission-driven organizations 20 years ago, there's actually a lot of tools and services that are available at pretty low cost that will allow them to participate in a data-driven economy and to lead on data-driven innovation. The point is, it's just, you have to still do that. You have to build that foundation. To the point in the manifesto, you have to have workers who can do the work of, data collection, data governance, data analysis. The tools will help you, but there still needs to be a foundation of that expertise within those organizations.
Absolutely. And when you speak about foundation, one of the things the ODI constantly pushes for, in no surprise to anyone who knows what the ODI stands for, is a foundation of open data. And we've had a question from Paul, and then I'm obviously going to come to you on an ODI specific question here, but his view is the tide seems to have shifted against open data, in particular driven by AI's commercial rise, putting increased value on data, who has it, and gatekeeping that from competitors. What's your view on how that trend can be countered?
I think I'm just going to be a bit academic here, but say open data as we work with it at the ODI is data that is licensed openly in an unrestricted way. So there is a holder of the data, say publishing 20 spreadsheets on their website, and they're explicitly saying there's no restrictions on how these spreadsheets are going to be used. And that's a bit different from data that is in the public domain without the specific license or terms of use associated with it. And then there's also data that is available through APIs for developers, and then you have these multi-tier models where you can access a little bit of it, and then if you access a bit more, then you need to pay or other arrangements. Yeah. So what we have seen is that the data that is available in the public domain, or the data that is available via APIs, is now not as accessible in terms of price, in terms of technology, as it used to be. But then at the same time, we've also seen that there's a lot of hype and misinformation about the value of this potential unrealized value of this data. What of course has happened was that grounds are shifting, and some data holders fear that their data has been scraped and used in a way or by an organization that is now going to extract huge benefits from it, and they are reacting sometimes in rational, sometimes in irrational ways. One of the studies that I like citing in this context is called Consenting Crisis. It's not done by the ODI, it's colleagues at MIT and in other places that have looked at different websites that have data in the public domain and how their access restrictions, which are written in technology called robots.txt. So that's a file that is associated with a website that says, do this, don't do this. Please don't access my website so much that it crashes. Don't do this, don't. And that's something that cannot be technically enforced, but it's typically respected, or used to be typically respected. Now this has changed a lot. And then the study is looking at how those terms of use have changed as well after ChatGPT. And you see a number of behaviors from organizations trying to, or individuals trying to react by rewriting those terms to be more restrictive against certain companies, but not others, and so on and so forth. But fact is, 30% of that public data is not as accessible, as available as it used to be. And this has consequences for anyone who starts out now, but also it reinforces a behavior that over time will mean that the majority of the world will not have access to the same quality of information online as it used to be. And we collectively
I'm gonna have to
will
stop
need
you there
to fix this.
Amazing, thank you. Perfect ending, because I want final 30 seconds, Mike. I just wanted to ask you very quickly, 30 seconds. What are the world events, geopolitical, economic, climate, or anything else that you think could force policymakers to move in the right direction?
In 30 seconds. I mean, that's an open-ended question, because I don't, if you're talking about the right direction in terms of data regulation,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think Draghi, and we're talking about Europe, I think patron saint of competitiveness, Mario Draghi, has identified, it's notable that he had very broad remit in his study, and he identified Europe's lagging digital innovation as the key driver of its economic underperformance over the last 2 decades. So I think that should be a wake-up call. And if it's not, I worry a bit about the EU ever kind of like changing its approach in this area.
Amazing, thank you. That was a monster of a question and you handled it perfectly. I promised to let everyone go at 5, so I'm going to keep the thank yous very short, but I hope you'll all join me in thanking Ann-Kristin, Elena, and Mike, our brilliant panelists. Thank you so much for joining. Please do sign up for our newsletter if you haven't. A big thank you to my colleagues Joe and Martha for organising and pulling together this brilliant panel that I get to swoop in on and moderate. And thank you so much to the whole policy team for pulling together this manifesto. We've come to the end of our event. Before we go, my colleague will be popping into the chat upcoming events and that we've got coming up. Please do attend them. We'd love to have you. And if you've got any questions, anything you'd like us to host events on, we're always keen to pull together and curate events that our members and attendees would enjoy. We've got a great one coming on the 1st of August on data ethics professionals. That's on AI governance in action on the 1st of August. That's going to be popped in the chat. And then we have another one on personal data security and dark patterns on the 17th of September. But if you sign up, you'll get information about all of those. A big thank you again to Mike, Ann-Kristin, and Elena. And thank you all so much for your time today. Sorry for running over by a minute. And hopefully you're all happy that you got your questions answered. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Resham. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Resham. Bye.